Hi, guys. Welcome to the first official episode of Come Now and Let Us Reason Together as we break down Isaiah chapter 1. Now, I already have to apologize. You might hear it in my voice. I don't know. I mean, you guys don't know my voice that well, but I do have a cold. And I wasn't going to record anything today, but then as I was studying this chapter, I was like, I gotta say it. I gotta talk. So here's hoping that my voice holds out. I've asked for a blessing from the Lord to help that happen. And pardon me for inaugurating this whole series with a cold and a whole bunch of extra resonance in my nasal passage. But I trust that you guys can overlook that and we can get to the meat of what's going on in Isaiah chapter 1. So, once again, just a review, I am no scholar. I am just sharing with you what I study, some of my own thoughts, but mostly what I find in the resources as I've been digging in. So, those resources, once again, are sepharia.org. That gives you the Hebrew to English translation. BlueLetterBible.org, which gives you word for word breakdown of why they translated the word that they did and other occurrences in Scripture. Also, just Google actually for the etymology of English words and why that was appropriate to translate there, along with the LDS.org Institute Manual for the Old Testament and Edward J. Young's 3-volume series of commentary on Isaiah. Uh, this chapter specifically is near and dear to my heart, so let's go ahead and get into it. So, to start off, for those of you that are listening that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, the format of this first chapter of Isaiah is very similar to what we experience with Doctrine and Covenants section 1. What I mean by that is that Doctrine and Covenants section 1 isn't chronologically the first section that was done. It was written later on to give a preview and a summary of what's to come and to kind of like begin the book with a preface. That is very similar to what happens in Isaiah chapter 1. The first verse of the chapter even outlines every single king that reigned while Isaiah was prophesying. So we know that this is already like somebody who knows the end from the beginning and isn't just going along. And the entire layout of this first chapter tends to summarize the entire book. That of warning to Israel and letting them know, by the way, God is not happy with your sins and how you haven't turned to Him, and it is time to turn to Him. What happens if you don't? Are there going to be these different consequences? There's the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity being one of them. And then there's also this message of hope that says, but don't worry, Israel has still not lost God's favor. You are still His chosen people. He's not going to completely wipe you off the map. There is still going to be a remnant, a holy remnant, that's compared to a holy seed that is left that will be able to perpetuate forward. And I know that doesn't always sound terribly hopeful to us, especially as a modern audience, because we're like, I don't know, just really sensitive to any threat of annihilation. Well, I get that sentiment too. I don't really particularly care for the idea of having to wipe out an entire people group. However, it becomes abundantly clear in the writings of Isaiah, along with other scriptures like Chronicles and Kings, where we see the kinds of things that the people are doing, and we recognize, ooh, that is really not good. Like, super, super horrible, in fact. And I don't know if we'd want a society to continue on this earth that acts like this one does. So, anyway, that's the overall message of Isaiah. And let's go ahead and get started reading it. I'm going to be reading it predominantly from Sepharia.org, just because the language is a little less obscure than it is in the King James Version of the Bible. And yeah, let's go. Isaiah chapter 1. The prophecies of Isaiah, son of Amos, who prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Something that's interesting to note is that even though Isaiah's predominant audience, at least from what it says on this title page of sorts, is that he's speaking to Judah and Jerusalem. We know, based on the content in the rest of the book, that he is also talking about Gentiles. He's also talking about the other tribes of Israel. So this is really interesting that this title page would specifically focus and say, this message is to Judah and Jerusalem. And I think that helps us orient the book a little bit better and realize that, like, the primary lens that Isaiah is speaking from is from Judah and Jerusalem, which has dual meaning. It has the first meaning of talking about the actual Israelites at the time this is happening because he's living in Judah and he's talking with Judean kings. Then that makes sense that he's talking to this people directly. Another interesting interpretation, and this is an interpretation that I've heard and that I'm partial to, but that doesn't mean it's doctrine. So, vet it if you will, is to consider that this is talking to us in this day and age, which that part's not super foreign. But what is the idea that he's talking to the people who live in Utah specifically. And part of the reason why I got this from Morgan Philpott, he's on YouTube and he used to be a lawyer and so he's really deep into research. And he broke down the word Judah. We pronounce it Judah, but in the ancient Hebrew, it would have been a y sound at the front. So it would have been Judah. And when we became, for those of us that live in Utah, when we became a state, we actually wanted to be Deseret. That was the name that we had chosen. And instead, it was given to us by other people who weren't members of our church that we would be Utah. And the sound is so similar from Judah to Utah. And that doesn't seem coincidental. Another thing that's really interesting is the geographical map that National Geographic back in I want to say the 80s or 90s did a comparison between the geography of the Holy Land and the Great Salt Lake. And the way that we are situated along the Salt Lake in Utah, like Salt Lake City, is identical to the situation of Jerusalem in Israel and its relation to the salt water around it. So the title of that article is Geographical Twins Worlds Apart. So we see that they overlay the maps and it is astounding how similar geographically the Salt Lake Valley is to the Holy Land. So that's something to consider of maybe the reason why it specifically says in Isaiah 1 that this is to Judah and Jerusalem is because he wants those of us, so them back then, he wants them to pay attention. He wants us in Utah now to pay attention too. Okay, let's continue forward. Verse 2. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for God has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, and they have rebelled against me. An ox knows its owner, a donkey its master's crib. Israel does not know. My people takes no thought. So, with regards to verse 3, it is generally considered in animal husbandry, at least this is according to Edward J. Young's analysis, that an ox and a donkey are some of the dullest animals, the dullest livestock available on farms. And yet, even an ox knows who is hooking him up to the yoke and to the plow. He can recognize who is doing that, and especially if the master has been good to him, then he can recognize it for good and work hard and not fight against the master when the master's trying to hook him up. A donkey is even more dull than an ox because a donkey doesn't actually ever recognize the master, at least rarely. What the donkey does recognize is the food trough and where the food is coming from. And that's what it means, a donkey, its master's crib. The actual word used there is meaning manger or food trough. So the donkey can recognize its master's food trough, at least. It can recognize at least where the blessings come from, where its sustenance comes from. And that's quite insulting to the Israelites because with the creation of man, way back in the beginning, we see that Adam was given the ability to name all of the animals around him, and he was given dominion over the entire earth. So, in the hierarchy of living creatures, you've got plants, animals, because animals are actually sentient, and then you have humans on top of animals because they are more intelligent than even the sentience of animals. So, here in verse 3, this is just like insult to injury to say, even these less sentient beings know where their upkeep comes from and who is taking care of them. And Israelites, my chosen people, don't even know me. No idea. So Sefaria.org has the translation go as think. The King James Version has consider is the word. So my people doth not consider. When you go back to the Hebrew word, it means bean. That's how you say it, bean. It means to perceive, observe, or think about. So this is different than just like an innate capacity. Like some of us just aren't capable as of being as smart as others. I feel like I'm in that category. I just don't have a capacity for certain types of intelligence. This is not talking about capacity. This is talking about choice. These people do not choose to see. They do not observe. They don't even think about it. Um, which is I think will become more relevant later on because my first reaction is always like, how's that possible? How, when you have this like intense backstory of the Exodus, that you come into this promised land, that you have the rites of worship around you. I mean, it could you could easily consider it all to just be, oh, that's an interesting legend and origin story that's not true. I guess I suppose that's possible, right? But if that's like the rich heritage that you come from, where every year at Passover they're talking about how they were delivered from Egypt, and you eat a lamb and you talk among each other. I mean, the whole Passover experience is designed to answer fundamental questions about the Exodus. It was supposed to keep the Exodus alive so that everyone could remember. We are in covenant with Jehovah. We are different. We were rescued. We are in relationship with the God of the universe. And to have that yearly ritual and since like you were born, have that yearly ritual and reminder and not even think about it, that's like that's not about innate intelligence. This is about deciding to ignore him. It is willful ignorance. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 4. Sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, brood of evildoers, depraved children, they have forsaken God, spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs. Okay, so a couple notes here. Here is where I am drawing from the Bible Project on YouTube. It's a whole series. Tim Mackie is the theologian behind it. I love listening to him. He's a fantastic thinker as well as just really approachable and easy to listen to. So if you ever want to look for him, Tim Mackie on YouTube or the Bible Project, they have a series of 3 videos that explain the words sin, iniquity, and transgression. And these have been really helpful with helping me conceptualize these words. So in verse 4, when it says sinful nation, just to summarize, the word sin in Hebrew is chata, which means to miss the mark. And it's predominantly, I think it's first employed or predominantly employed by people who sling or slingshots, kind of like David was, and they have a stone and a sling. And these are people who the Israelites become so proficient that they do not chata, they don't miss. So when you're talking about sin, and especially in the Levitical system of worship, there are 2 types of sin that can be covered, 2 types of missing the mark that are covered for. One is ignorant sin. And that is really profound because we as humans, we are full of weakness, and it's really easy to just miss the mark without even knowing you're missing the mark, to swing and a miss. And part of that is just by virtue of developing. In your development, every human has to make mistakes in their development. Like a toddler trying to learn how to walk, they have to fall several times in order to become accustomed to gravity. So that word, chata, means that kind of level of missing the mark. The ignorant I'm developing, there's no need for shame in that kind of development because you don't know. Like there's nothing wrong with making a mistake as you're trying to understand how to do things right. The other type of sin that's covered is willful sin. The kind of sin, the kind of missing the mark that results in separation of your relationships that can hurt another person, that can ruin trust between you another person, you and yourself, and you and God. So when it says it's a sinful nation, like sin itself isn't the problem, it's unrepentant sin that is. It is not turning to Jehovah, not going and getting that sin taken care of, that causes an issue. So this is a people who are sin sick and won't go get help. And now, for the second word, iniquity, a people laden with iniquity. Before I move on to iniquity, actually, it's very much important to notice that the sacrificial system of the Jews, there are 5 main types of sacrifices. three of which deal with sin and their severity. And the position that you're in, say that you're in a position of like leadership, either ecclesiastical leadership or in like terms of royalty. Whatever position you're in and how much stewardship you have determines the size of the animal that you offer. So if you're a king, you have to offer a bullock, and it has to be really particular, um, because you have to show that like I have a lot of potential for sin, for missing the mark, even with the best of intentions, and I need that covered. It's an indictment against the Israelites that they are full of sin. It's twofold. Not only are you missing the mark and making a lot of mistakes, but I have already provided a way for you to remedy that sin, and you're not doing it. You're not going and worshiping at the temple. So these are people who aren't offering the sacrificial offerings that were intended to take care of that sin and put someone back in a right relationship with Jehovah. So they just weren't doing it. And even later on, we'll see that those of them that do, they do it without actually investing. Like it's all just for show. And that's why Jehovah gets fed up with the sacrificial system, because he's like, I'm tired of the fat of your rams. I'm tired of your burnt offerings and your incense, because I know it doesn't mean anything to you. Your heart's not in it. Anyway, we'll get to that. So moving on to iniquity, the Hebrew word that's used for iniquity is avon, which can mean like the guilt of iniquity or the consequence or punishment, perversity, depravity. And the Bible Project does a really good job of showing how the very, very root word is crookedness. When something is in iniquity, it means it's unequal and unjustified. And my dad is a chiropractor, and this really hits home for me that like if you're ever not in alignment, you can tell. For me, it's my hips. My left hip specifically really loves wandering about my body and creating a misalignment in my spine and making one of my legs longer than the other, and it's painful. It's not pleasant. It restricts my movement. And in order to come back into alignment, I have to be justified. And that's what the job of a chiropractor is to put you back into alignment, put your bones back in their proper place so that you're not walking around crooked. That's what I think of when I think of iniquity. It is someone who is seeing the world through a lens of crookedness. And that means injustice and inequality too, because you're either seeing another person as an obstacle, something that's in your way of what you want, or you're seeing them as an opportunity, somebody you can take advantage of to get what you want. That is what an iniquitous person does. They use other people. They do not value another human as an equal human being. And that is the exact thing that we decry when we talk about big pharma. And there are plenty of instances where in government or in big business, I mean, there's so many stories of people in big business and in government and in other positions where they have leadership and rulership over each other, even down to the mundane manager employee experience. I've heard so many of those stories too, where the person who's in a position of power sees an opportunity to use another person, and they do. That would be classified as iniquity. So it's worth noting in verse 7 that the language is a people laden with iniquity. That implies that this is a weight, a huge weight to carry. And it makes me think, honestly, I love TV shows. You'll get to know that real quick. One of my favorite TV shows right now is The Rookie with Nathan Fillion. And one of the characters, he's a side character, he's a lawyer who is invested in trying to defend people who really, he defends criminals. That's what he does. And he's really good at it because he thinks that every single person needs to have a fair trial and a fair defense. So his name's Wesley, and he later on marries a detective. He gets into a situation at one point where his wife has been taken captive by a cartel leader, and so he ends up going to another drug dealer to get help, and finds himself in a position where the only way that drug dealer is going to help him is if he offers his services and gets every one of his criminals that's in his organization out of prison and keeps him out of prison. He becomes a corrupt lawyer in order to do this. And we see the weight that this this has on Wesley. He is like morally struggling really hard when after he's gotten his wife back and everything's hunky dory and he's back home, and now it's time for this drug boss to get what he desired from him, what they agreed to, and to live up to the agreement. And he has to go against his moral character several times to defend somebody that he knows is indefensible, that he knows committed this crime, and it really weighs on him. He crumbles at one point under this weight, and I think of that in relation to iniquity, um, because very often what starts iniquity is by covering our sins ourselves. That's really the origin point, where when we've recognized I've messed up, we have an option. Do we go to the people who will help me reconcile it? Do I go to Jehovah? Do I say I'm sorry to my family members or to my friends, whoever it was that I hurt and that is affected by my chata? Or do I deny it? Do I cover it up? Do I try and take care of it myself? And if you go that route, it is a heavy burden to carry. There's a lot more secrecy. There's a lot more additional crookedness that has to happen in order to keep your front up. It's undiagnosed, it's untriaged crookedness that ends up happening within you. You have to compromise your morals in order to go that route. So it is a heavy burden to carry to have iniquity. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent, but I think it might be worthwhile and might be accessible. Okay, verse 5. This one really got me. Why do you seek further beatings, that you continue to offend? Every head is ailing, and every heart is sick. From head to foot, no spot is sound. All bruises and welts and festering sores, not pressed out, not bound up, not softened with oil. These two are some of my favorite verses in this entire book of Isaiah. So I love these two verses particularly because we see that when Jehovah's looking down at his people in the previous verses, and he's like, y'all are full of sin and you're full of iniquity and you're not coming to me. We get a snapshot, a perspective of what he sees when he sees a sinful nation and a people laden with heavy burdens of iniquity. Instead of looking at us with like, shame on you, you should have listened to me, I can't believe it, punishment for all, which is, how I honestly treat myself. When I've done something that hurts another person, the voice in my head says, how dare you? You can never be trusted again. You hurt someone else, and it crushes my heart when I've hurt someone else. All I want to do is immediately fix it and undo it and grovel even, because of how much I hate that feeling of being in the wrong. So to have Jehovah's perspective not be, how dare you, condemning you all. Instead, it's, you all are sick. From head to foot, no spot is sound. You're full of bruises and welts and festering sores, and you haven't been healed. Like, to me, in that moment, his voice is so full of compassion. When he sees chata and avon, sin and iniquity, he sees sickness, not shame. And he doesn't ever, at any point, say, that's it, I've disowned you. I want nothing more to do with you. Instead, he's like, I'm the healer. I want to heal this. And it just evokes such compassion. I mean, how often are we given those advertisements that show us really skinny children in Africa that like play on our heartstrings, and they say, for so many dollars a month, you can help take care of and feed this child, because it really does like just pull on you. You hurt a little bit when you see that happening for someone else, and it's really awesome to know that when an entire nation has turned their back on God, well, most of an entire nation, not the whole nation, but most of them have turned their back on God, he's not butthurt. Instead, he's like, you must be sick. You must not be feeling well. I want to take care of you. And especially in verse 5, where it asks, Why do you seek further beatings? Oh, that got me. Because I'm probably not the only one who thinks that the only way to keep myself from making a mistake again is by beating it out of me. By saying, "Oh my gosh, Dara, why did you do that? That is ridiculous. Don't ever do it again." I think the solution to khata is shame. Is saying, "You need to hide this. You need to not tell anybody. You can take care of it yourself. And by the way, this is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. I want you to remember what this felt like so that you never ever do it again." And that is the kind of people that the Israelites are. Like God, Jehovah, in this situation can just cut right through it and see to that wound that's underneath, that the psychology of wanting to beat yourself up or wanting to beat someone else up to discharge the pain that you feel from the sin or from the iniquity. So, to ask that question, why do you seek further beatings? That you continue to offend. It's also just like so perceptive, isn't it? That he can tell, I know why you're acting the way that you are. You're hurt and you're beating yourself up, and that's not the solution. And in my life, there have been it's countless. There's so many times where God has come to me when I'm like, I'm the worst. You should give up on me. I told you I wasn't going to be able to figure this out. I'm not getting anywhere. There's been zero progress on my end. That he has just like, can you just remove the boxing gloves that you're punching yourself with? And I want you to know, I'm not ashamed of you. I love you. I'm not going anywhere. You'll get there. I trust you. It's gonna be okay. Like, he helps me stop beating myself up because he knows that the solution to sin is forgiveness, not shame. The solution to iniquity is letting him justify you, put you back into alignment, reach into that part of your heart that is crooked, that feels hurt and feels like you have to cover it up, and exposing it and saying, I got this. I can heal it. Yeah, these verses have been obviously very impactful for me to help me see that Jehovah is a God of healing, not a God of condemnation. And especially in the Old Testament, he gets a bad rep, doesn't he? We look at the Old Testament often and think, wow, he's destroying this city and that city and telling the Israelites to wipe out this entire country and nation. And now he's turning against the Israelites. Like, it's really easy to see a lot of the brutality. But here, it's clearly a peek into his heart to see that it's not brutality that's behind this. And it's not purse clutching or saying, you can't defile my name ever. It's not offense or punishment or a desire to humble that's behind all of this. It is an understanding that we are already sick. And the way to heal us is to have our sins exposed, even though it's painful. It's to have the reality of our situation shown to us, which is what happens next in verse 7. He's telling them, even though it's full of inhabitants, the city of Jerusalem is inhabited. Yet he still says, your land is a waste. The other translation in the King James Version is your land is desolate. And desolate, the root of that, the etymology of desolate, is profoundly alone. It means it's empty. So your land is actually empty. Your cities burnt down. Before your eyes, the yield of your soil is consumed by strangers. A wasteland is overthrown by strangers. And that's not saying like anything for or against any kind of immigration. It's not a commentary on that. It's simply saying people who aren't of this covenant and the societal agreement that you guys all are partaking in, those are the ones who are reaping the spoils of your hard work. So he's trying to show them the reality. The reality is your land is empty of good things. This land that I brought you guys to with after taking you out of Egypt was supposed to flow with milk and honey, which that means that there is enough rainwater pouring down, and the land is lush enough and nutrient rich enough to be able to support the wildlife necessary to create honey. There has to be flowers and plenty of them in order to yield honey. There has to be enough grass in order to yield milk from cows. Because just like us, when there is a famine, or there isn't enough to eat, animals shut down their reproductive systems as a protective measure so that they're not devoting energy to something that's not sustaining their lives. We do the same thing. So to come into a land of milk and honey means it is a land of abundance. And now there that land of abundance is desolate. That's what he's saying. It is no longer this fruitful utopia and paradise that I wanted it to be. In verse 8, it says, "Fair Zion is left, like a booth in a vineyard, like a hut in a cucumber field, like a city beleaguered." A booth in a vineyard, if you don't know, when they are in harvest season, because their fields may be so big that they will create temporary shelters in the field as they're harvesting, because it's more than a day's walk across these fields. So it's like pitching a tent. Only in this case, it's using the vegetation around them, and they don't even worry about getting rid of it once they walk on and continue harvesting. They just let it sit there. So the booth being left in a vineyard is indicative of everything's been harvested, there's nothing left. That's what it's supposed to evoke, is this imagery of everything's barren, everything's been consumed already. Harvest is over. All that's left are those booths showing you what used to be. Hath not, or had not God of hosts left us some survivors, we should be like Sodom, another Gomorrah. So this is one of the verses that lets us know that this is a title page written after the rest of the book, because throughout the rest of the book of Isaiah, we hear Isaiah prophesy not only about the Assyrian captivity of northern Israel, that happens before the Babylonian captivity of Judah. So it talks about those two things. And then, so yeah, the language shifts from chapter 40 through the rest of the book to speak as though the captivity is already over. It's as though he's a prophet and he can see into the future and speak to the Jews that are coming back to their homeland and try and rebuild up the rest of the city that is now destitute. So this verse gives us that same kind of feeling. He's speaking as though the captivity has already happened and that we're already assured that there are survivors. And this comparison, like Sodom and Gomorrah, I mean, those are names that are familiar to us. Those were two cities that were so depraved, and I speak more about that in later chapters, that the only fitting solution was to destroy every single inhabitant in those cities. And there was none left over, because the way that they lived was so bad that it could not be risked being passed on to anyone else. So, he's saying, well, hey, look, at least at least we have some survivors. There's this holy remnant. There are people who will come back to the homeland, or have come back to the homeland. That's how he's talking. Otherwise, we would have been as deserving as Sodom and Gomorrah of being entirely wiped out. Verse 10, "Hear the word of God, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to your God's instructions, you folk of Gomorrah." So here he shifts after he introduces Sodom and Gomorrah. He then shifts to talking to Israel as though Israel is Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's like serious shade being thrown here, which is just amazing. I love seeing sass in scriptures, where he's like, it might be, this is a really imperfect analogy, so forgive it, but it's almost like he is calling the mayor of a city, like, you're like a mob boss. Hey, what's up, mob boss? So he immediately then throws back that title at them to catch their attention. So after introducing and saying, you're like Sodom and Gomorrah, yo, Sodom and Gomorrah, listen up. Verse 11, "What need have I of all your sacrifices, says God? I am sated with burnt offerings of rams, and suet of fatlings, and blood of bullocks. I have no delight in lambs and he goats, that you come to appear before me. Who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Bringing oblations is futile. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with iniquity, I cannot abide. So, those three verses deal entirely with their sacrificial system. Like I mentioned before, there are 5 predominant sacrifices. Let me actually look up and give you the names. I used to know this off the top of my head, but I need to look it up. Give me a sec. Okay, so here's where I went to go find this information. Should you want to look this up for yourself, I went to lds.org. I found the student or the institute manuals, specifically the Old Testament student manual. There's 2 of them for like the first half of the Old Testament and the second half. I went to the first half because that's where it's all contained is around Leviticus. The whole book of Leviticus is designed to answer the question of how can we be worthy to enter God's presence? And that's what ensues is the entire sacrificial system. So the first one is called the burnt offering. That's where you sacrifice the entire animal whole on the altar. There are different times when you do this. For example, at the beginning of a child's life, when they go and offer an offering to inaugurate, they will offer a burnt offering. So it has this representation of all of our sins are consumed, and our entire life is devoted in holy consecration to God. That's kind of what the burnt offering represents. All of me is now set apart for God's glory. That's like the long and the short of it. The peace offering, that's the second one. This one is done out of gratitude. It's essentially a holy barbecue, which is just awesome. You bring a bullock, which is a cow, and different parts of it are sacrificed. For example, I think the shoulder is given to the priests, and that way they can feast off of it if they want to. But the rest of it is divided between you and between Jehovah. So it ends up being this meal between you and your friends, you and the priest, you and Jehovah. What you sacrifice to Jehovah is the inner visceral fat inside the animal, which is really not terribly edible for us anyway, and some of the organs. And then what you end up eating is like the muscle meat and a lot of the fat. And oddly enough, the command is to eat it within a 2-day period, as much of it as possible. Anything that's left over is burnt on the altar. And there's one theory that I've heard that explains, like, why would that be? Why would God command that? And I really like this theory. It's that it is supposed to designate abundance. That's the point of the peace offering, is to show you, Jehovah, and we're in a good relationship with each other, and I just want to celebrate that fact. It doesn't cover for any sins, it's just out of sheer gratitude and just to celebrate. So the idea of having to consume the entire animal within a short period of time forces you and everyone else who's participating in this to eat abundantly, truly feast on this animal. So that there's so little left over. So it's just like this huge cause of celebration. It's one of my favorite favorite of the Levitical offerings, which is weird to say. Who has a favorite? I don't know. Nerds like me. Okay, and then the other 3 offerings deal predominantly with sin. One of them is the sin offering itself, and it was offered on the Day of Atonement. It's to cover the entire population of Israel. The trespass offering, which is offered when there's been a betrayal of trust. So it's also a sin, but it's when there needs to be a repairing of relationship. If you took something, swore false witness, whatever it is, you offer the animal and you also pay restitution of 20% of what you took or what you defamed. Either way, it's to help reinstitute trust and prevent too much vengeance from taking place, where somebody might say, I'm suing you for defamation, and having it be an entirely preposterous number that they sue you for. It was restricted to only 20%. So I think that's brilliant, because you offer the offering saying, I know I messed up. I'm owning it. This animal has to die in my place. When they offer the animal, they have to lay their hands on it beforehand and have all of their sins symbolically conferred to that animal, which is really cool. So it is when it says your sins are taken away. This is the imagery that's evoked. And then you have to pay restitution to that person. So that's the trespass offering. And then you have the meal, or sometimes called the meat offering, which is actually bread. Bread laced with incense, and it's burnt on the altar. And it's especially used for those who, it's an addendum to the peace offering. You add a meal or a meat offering to the peace offering to make it complete. Also, it is for those who have nothing else that they can offer. It can be in place of their own personal sin offerings. I messed up. I want to offer something. So they offer bread, and it gets burnt on the altar with a nice sweet smell. I know as modern people, we tend to think a lot of this sounds barbaric, but let me just reassure you guys, as somebody, so I eat mostly meat. And there are a lot of reasons why that is. I might get into it in a different video, but not today. The scent that fills your home when you eat a lot of meat, especially when you're willing to fry beef fat, you would think it would smell disgusting. It smells almost like donuts. It's amazing. Like, animal fat is incredibly sustaining. So all of these sacrificial offerings make a lot of sense to me as someone who's experienced the peace of mind, the satisfaction in my body of being well nourished. All of that comes to my mind when I think of these sacrificial offerings in the temple, because that's what Jehovah was inviting them to experience. He's like, come worship with me, eat some of this food with me. Let's break bread together, which in the Middle East, I talked to a gentleman who he's from the Middle East. He speaks all sorts of languages over there. He was a Davidic Christian, I think, at one point. And for them to break bread with another person over there is to make a covenant. If you break bread, that means that you will not betray that person. If the government comes in and questions you about your neighbor and you've broken bread with that neighbor, you won't divulge anything. So to have these sacrificial offerings be done where you're making these covenants with Jehovah is just this really beautiful thing where he's like, come get nourished, let me take care of you. So that has intense significance then in Isaiah chapter 1, when he's like, what need have I of all of your sacrifices? He's trying to get at the root of like, I instituted these sacrificial offerings for you, not for me. I don't need you to offer anything on an altar for me in order for me to be there for you. So you coming to my altar and offering these sacrifices out of a superstition, that has no place here, which is what these people were doing, quite frankly. Their hearts wouldn't be changed. They'd just come and offer an act for political gain, or because that's like the right thing to do. Quote unquote, you didn't see me air quote unquote, the right thing to do according to society. They wanted to prove to other people that they were super righteous. That's why they were coming to the temple. That's why the leadership would do it. And yet in their hearts, they were still fully intent on sinning again, on being full of iniquity again, on committing injustice, on keeping the poor impoverished. All of that. So that is why when these 3 verses come and he's like, I'm sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls. I have no delight in lambs and he goats. And he's essentially being like, look, I can't abide lip service. I want the real thing. I want a relationship with you. I don't want you to just offer stuff to me because you think that's what I want. Which, coming from their background in Egypt, that is what the Egyptians do. They offer offerings to placate gods. That's their role. And one of the favorite books that I've ever read, it was, oh geez, I don't remember the name of the author, but the title is What is the Bible? And it got me thinking on a whole new plane when it came to idol worship. Because that's kind of mysterious to me. Like, why would you ever worship idols? That doesn't make sense. Yet he laid down something. What he illustrated was, this author, is that when someone lives on the land and their whole livelihood and their survival over the wintertime depends on their harvest season, they get a little desperate. It's a very vulnerable position to be in. And or they can get a little desperate, especially in times of drought. So what might happen is they might think, there's been a drought. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I offended the person who's in charge of making it rain. And maybe I should give them an offering to show that I care about what they do. They matter to me. I'm grateful. And so it might start off with like some of the choicest plants that they've got. They might offer them up in some manner. And then if the next season there was a good rainfall, then that validates them and they say, sweet, I placated whoever's in charge of that. Now we're good. And then also there's the sneaking suspicion behind all of that, though, that like maybe if I want to make sure that there's a good season next season, I should offer more. So it just like loops you into this uncertain state where you're trying to placate whoever's in charge of the elements and trying to bribe them so that you can get through the next season. And it can escalate and escalate and escalate so far that you'll even offer that which is most precious, your own children. That's the kind of mentality that seems to be applied here, that Isaiah is calling out, where they are treating him like a Pez dispenser and not a person, where they're trying to get something from him. It's when they turn their iniquity towards God and say, you're an object, I can use you for something, instead of seeing him as a person to have a relationship with. That's why Jehovah gets so tired of their burnt offerings. He's like, how often can I let you desecrate this like incredible, meaningful thing that I instituted? It's one of my favorite things, and you're just like desecrating it. I've been trying to think of a good analogy, but nothing's come to me. I might in another episode as I think about it even more. But so stay tuned for that. To keep going, you're in verse 14, your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They are become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. This is referencing the festival calendar. The April-ish time is the time of Passover, beautiful festival. Then you have in the fall, Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year, and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and then there's Festival of Tabernacles. I can't remember if that's around the time of the Passover or not, but there are a lot of times in the year where they have holidays. They're beautiful things. Jews are remarkably good at calendar worship and the times and the seasons, yo. So he's saying not only is your like temple worship loathing to me, but these holidays that were supposed to be like us spending time together, I don't like it. And on a small personal note, so my family is blended family. My parents got divorced when I was younger. I have, I like saying I have 5 parents and 12 siblings because my dad remarried, they got divorced, and now he's remarried to his third wife. My mom's remarried to her second husband. So holidays used to be a hard thing for me because everybody that I wanted to be there at once couldn't ever be. There was no way that one side of my family could make it to the other side of my family's stuff. It'd just be awkward. And so I always felt, instead of like this feeling of closeness and celebration, it was one of loss and mourning of like, who isn't here? It just made me incredibly sad. Like I could never fully be with the people that I loved. And it's really reassuring to me to know in this tiny verse in Isaiah chapter 1 that like Jehovah gets it. He gets it. Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. I'm like, man, you get that holidays suck sometimes, don't you? And that was really rehabilitative for my heart. Now I find holidays to be wonderful reasons to celebrate. They're not sources of pain for me anymore, in part because of this verse and because Jesus was willing to say, I get it. I feel you. This is rough. And life-changing. My heart changed because of it. Something interesting to note about new moons. When it says new moons, it's referencing the fact that it's the first new moon in September/October that begins the new year of Rosh Hashanah. It also has meaningful significance towards the phrase, no man knoweth the day or the hour. That's how Rosh Hashanah works. The new year requires people to keep watch every night for a few weeks to see when the new moon begins. And that's when they know that Rosh Hashanah is happening and that they've officially begun a new year. So when it says new moons, I think it's relating to Rosh Hashanah. It could be relating to other things too, but Rosh Hashanah is one of them. Because they use They use the lunar calendar a lot of times for all of their festival seasons as well. Moving on, last 3 verses before we close this episode. Or sorry, last 4. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. Wash yourselves. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. So, this is in reference to prayer postures, right? There are different ways that you can pray in the Old Testament and any kind of worship, really. You can pray, we as Latter-day Saints tend to pray now with our heads bowed and our arms folded. But back then, especially if they were praying in public, they would lift their hands up and pray out loud. There were some instances, too, where someone might pray flat on their face if they're feeling really, really destitute, or sitting down or kneeling. There are lots of prayer postures. So this one's talking about the more public prayer posture where you have both your hands high and you're shouting out loud. When he says to wash yourselves, put your evil doings away from my sight and cease to do evil, this is in reference to in Leviticus when he says, don't come with a trespass offering for me until you've made it right with your brother. Don't bring it until you've gone to the person that you've offended and tried to make it right. Shoot, I'm a little embarrassed. I can't find where the Old Testament reference is to this. But here's the New Testament reference that will be more familiar to us of this concept. So Matthew 5, verse 24. Matthew 5, verse 23 and 24. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. So Matthew 5:24 summarizes really well Isaiah 1:15 and 16, at least the principle behind it, that says, like, don't give me an offering until you intend to actually change and make restitution with the people around you. Jehovah/God is such a social being, one of community. That's what he's continuously looking towards, is making us into a community that is unified. So it makes sense why he's like, your hands are stained with crime, and you need to prepare in order to be back in my presence. Hence, wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight and cease to do evil. This isn't actually an indictment, it's an invitation. The book of Leviticus brings out this interesting dichotomy. Instead of defining the world in terms of good and evil, it defines the world in terms of clean and unclean, common and holy. I'll link in the comments below the video that I got this from. At the top of my head, I can't remember the name of it, but it was really, really helpful and informative. And it's by this British gentleman who speaks really deliberately, so I really enjoyed listening to him. Anyway, he showed that in the book of Leviticus, the definition of clean and unclean is different than what we would think. When we think unclean, it's like, oh, you got some dirt on you. When they think unclean, they mean they came into contact with something mortal. That means like human blood, a dead body, women who are on their periods, they are unclean because those things represent this temporary state of mortality. And it's not sinful to be unclean per se. We all have times when we have to be unclean. What is sinful is coming into God's presence when you're in an unclean state, if you haven't taken care of it. And there are many ways that they took care of ritual impurity or uncleanness, many of which involved bathing in ritually pure water, in order to say, I've taken care of that, where I've set myself apart from the things of this world so that I can come into God's presence. That's essentially what you do when you go from unclean to clean. You're preparing yourself to be in an environment where God is. Then, in terms of common and holy, if something is common, it's everyday and it's not meaningful. It's as simple as like preparing your food or going to the bathroom or going to work. It's stuff that's average, everyday, everyone has to do it, not super significant. That's different from holy. Holy is to be unique and uniquely connected to God, to someone who is pure and pure love, and it's likened to the intensity of the sun. The sun is considered holy, at least in our solar system, because it is a unique source of light, it is intense, and it is pure. So, Once again, being common isn't like sinful per se. What's wrong is when you make something holy common. And that kind of has happened in our society. Here's a more superficial example before I go to the heavy hitter one. Um, the gentleman that I referred to, or I'm going to refer to in the other YouTube channel that I watched, who talked about clean and unclean, he discussed a situation in Europe where I can't remember which country it was, but some compassionate Christians sent a whole bunch of the copies of the Bible to them at a time when they were pretty destitute. And since they didn't have toilet paper, people just ended up using the Bibles that they were given as toilet paper. That's an example of having something which is considered holy be used in a common purpose. There's something a little off about that. That just doesn't sit right to have the words of the Bible being used for something like that. So, what happens often in the Old Testament is this parallel between harlots or prostitution and the relationship between Israel and Jehovah. And part of the reason for that is because they've made this holy thing, the sacred relationship between a man and a woman who are wedded, they've made that common and readily available to anyone who asks it and has enough money. That is considered taking something holy, making it common. Obviously, that is not something that many people in our day and age really want to hear or even talk about. Not only prostitution, but for us, it's like the sexual revolution that happened in the 60s, where people said, you don't have to be in a married relationship in order to have sex with someone. All that's requisite is that you want to and that consent is available. That is biblically making something holy into something common. So, this invitation in Isaiah 1, verses 15 and 16 is to say, put aside that behavior, wash yourselves, become ritually pure, don't make that which is holy common, so that you can be ready to come back into my presence. It's all a preparatory thing. He wouldn't invite them to wash themselves if he wasn't going to want them to be in his presence. There'd be no need. But because he wants to be around them, he's inviting them to wash themselves in preparation for his coming. Which is continued forward in the last two verses here. In verse 17, learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow. These are the things that he's inviting them to adapt, because these are what he's already commanded them to do and that they haven't been doing. And in verse 18, come, let us reach an understanding, says God. Be your sins like crimson, they can turn white, snow white. Be they red as dyed wool, they can become like fleece. So here we have just this wonderful pinnacle where he's revealing his attitude towards Israel and saying, I want to be with you, and I want to forgive your sins. That can happen. And just this really tender invitation of like, will you just let me? Will you let me? And the Israelite population will see throughout the rest of the book of Isaiah, they don't. They don't let him, which is why the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity take place. So, that is a wrap up of Isaiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. I am so sorry it took so long. I just felt like this needed to hit home particularly well in order to really understand the book of Isaiah. Hopefully, going verse by verse is helpful for you to really breaking it down and understanding it in a new way. If there's something that I've said that you disagree with, please leave a comment below and we can start a discussion. That's what this is intended to be, is a jumping off point for discussion. Or if you have anything else to add, any additional insight, I'd love it. So thank you so much for tuning into this first episode of Come Now and Let Us Reason Together, and I hope you have a great day.